Now to add real validation, let's add a new shared element. In the shared folder, I'll add a util folder, and in there, paste in the validators.js file you find attached. Now this is simply a file with some validation logic. Now it's just one possible way of implementing this. It is the way I opted for. So what do we have in there? First, we have some identifiers of different validator types. For example, to validate for required input so that it's not empty, a minimum length input, a min or max value if we're talking about numeric input, if it's an email address, and if it's a file, which will become important later in the course. Then I export a couple of functions here, all written in all caps, which is not a must do, but which I do here to make clear that they're kind of defined globally in one place. And yeah, every function here is a really straightforward function that might or might not take an input, a value, and not the value the user entered, but a value to configure that validator. And then it returns basically a validator description, an object with a type, and then one of the identifiers above. The functions that do take an input are the validators that require extra configuration. For example, the min length validator needs to know which min length a string should have, and that's then stored in this val property. So in the end, these functions return validator configuration objects, you could say, where every object at least has a type and maybe also has a val. And then I have a validate function as well, which I export at the bottom. And this function takes a value, that's the concrete value the user entered into an input, and then an array of validators, and it then goes through that array of validators and checks for the different types we are aware of and runs different validation logic based on the type of validator we got. This is what happens here, and I got some predefined, relatively simple validation logic here because I want to focus on the React part and not too much on this validation logic part here. Of course, you can fine-tune and tweak this to your likings. Now, what do we do with the validators.js file? Well, we can go to our input component again, and there we want to add some validation logic, right? So let's start by importing the validate function from the util folder here, and then the validators file. Not all the other exported things, just the validate function. And here in the input reducer, we can then call validate and now pass in action.val, so the user input in our input field, and action.validators. That's an extra key we're not passing yet, which we also should provide. So action validators. Now, where is action validators coming from? Well, on the change handler, where we dispatch the change event, here, I want to add this validators key, and that should be coming from props. There should be a validators props passed to the input component. And indeed, if we have a look at new place, which is where we use the input component, I have validators here. It's just an empty array at the moment, but now with the extra utility file, we can change this. For that, let's simply import something from shared util validators. And the something I want to import here is the validator require function. Here in the validators array, we now just execute it, and this returns such a validator configuration object, as you learned. So what's the idea here now? With that, we're passing all the information to the input element that it needs to know that for this input, we want to make sure the value the user enters is not empty, because that is what I check for in the validators.js file. If the validator type is require, I check that the input is not empty. And we will have that validator type because that validator require function we're executing in new place returns an object where the type is set to validator type require. And I'm looking for that validator type down there in my validate function. So this is how these things work together. And with that, if we now save this, we start in an invalid state. As soon as I enter something, it becomes valid. But if I then empty this again, it's invalid again. So now we have real validation here for this field, which updates with every keystroke. And that's, of course, exactly what we want. But what we don't want, probably, is that when we start here, so when I reload this page, that it's marked in red right from the start. Technically, that is correct, of course. It is invalid. But we want to give the user a chance of at least entering one character before we start throwing errors at him. So to do that, we need to tweak our input component a bit more and list not just for the onChange event here, but also on the onBlur event, let's say, on the input and also, of course, on the text area. OnBlur is triggered when the user loses focus on the input element, which means the user had to click into it and then clicked out of it. And that, of course, is a good indicator to us that the user had a chance to enter something valid. And if it's then invalid after losing focus, then we want to show an error. Now for that, I'll add a new extra function here, the touch handler. And here we would also get an event, but I'm not interested in it. Instead here I want to dispatch a new action, and it's a different action, of course. It's an action where I set the type to touch. I don't offer any other input because we need no other input. So now here we can point at the touch handler, also of course on the text area. And we can now tweak our input reducer a bit. In the input reducer, I now want to make sure that we handle this touch case. So there, I want to return a state where I copy everything that's in there so that I don't lose the entered value, for example, but I update isTouched to true. IsTouched is a new field I add here, and therefore I also want to add it on my initial state where isTouched is set to false initially. So I set it to true once this blurs. Here in change I don't set it, but with this command I copy everything from the existing state, so we will have isTouched the state as well, we just don't change it here in this action type. So now we do manage this extra information, whether this has been touched or not, and therefore now we can go down to our JSX code and only add this invalid class if the input state is not valid and input state isTouched is true. So if it's invalid and the input was touched, so the user had a chance of changing it. And the same here for the error text. Only show it if input state isTouched is true. Now with that, this reloads and we see no error message initially. If I click in there though, and I don't enter anything valid, and I click out of there, we do see it. If I then enter something, it goes away, unless we really enter something invalid again. So this is now also working as it should. With that, we got basic validation implemented. We're not passing the information about the validity and the entered value back to new place though. And we should do that because ultimately new place is where we need to gather all the input, find out if the overall form is valid, and then also submit a request to the backend later in the course to create a new place on a server.